The afternoon sun streamed through the large windows of Riverside Diner, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. Margaret Williams wiped down the counter for the third time that hour, her mind elsewhere. At 22, she had been working at the diner for almost a year, saving money for nursing school while living with her boyfriend Derek in a small apartment downtown. The lunch rush had died down, leaving only a few regulars scattered across the red vinyl booths. Margaret glanced at the clock above the coffee machine. Another 3 hours until her shift ended. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through social media posts from her high school friends, who seemed to be living much more exciting lives than hers. The bell above the entrance chimed, and Margaret looked up reluctantly. An elderly black man walked in slowly, using a wooden cane to steady himself. He wore a faded military jacket with various patches and medals, his gray hair neatly combed despite the humid August weather. His kind eyes surveyed the nearly empty restaurant as he made his way toward a booth near the window. Margaret felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. She had grown up in a predominantly white neighborhood where her parents often made casual remarks about people who looked different from them. Those comments had shaped her worldview more than she cared to admit. Derek shared similar views, and their conversations often reinforced the prejudices she had absorbed throughout her childhood. The elderly man settled into the booth with some difficulty, carefully placing his cane against the table. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pair of reading glasses, then picked up the laminated menu from the table. His movements were deliberate and careful, suggesting someone who had learned patience through years of experience. Margaret stood behind the counter pretending to organize the napkin dispensers while stealing glances at her new customer. She felt uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite articulate. The other server, Janet, was on her break, and the manager, Mr. Rodriguez, was in the back office handling paperwork. Margaret knew she should walk over and take the man's order, but something held her back. Minutes passed, and the elderly man continued to study the menu patiently. He looked up occasionally, making eye contact with Margaret and offering a gentle smile. Each time, she quickly looked away, busying herself with unnecessary tasks. She rearranged the coffee cups, restocked the straws, and even started wiping down tables that were already clean. The man cleared his throat softly and raised his hand slightly, trying to get Margaret's attention. She saw him in her peripheral vision, but continued to ignore him, her heart racing with anxiety and shame. She knew her behavior was wrong, but the prejudices that had been ingrained in her since childhood felt stronger than her professional obligations. Other customers began to notice the situation. An older white couple in the corner booth exchanged confused glances, wondering why the server wasn't attending to the obvious customer. A young mother with her toddler looked up from her coloring book, sensing the tension in the air even though she couldn't quite identify its source. The elderly man remained patient, occasionally adjusting his glasses and reading the menu again. He seemed accustomed to waiting, though a slight sadness crept into his expression. His fingers drummed gently on the table, and he looked out the window at the busy street, watching cars and pedestrians pass by the diner. Margaret's internal conflict intensified with each passing minute. Part of her knew she was being unprofessional and unfair, but another part of her felt justified in her hesitation. The voices of her parents and Derek echoed in her mind, reinforcing the stereotypes and fears that had been planted there years ago. She had never directly confronted these beliefs or examined where they came from. The afternoon light shifted, creating new patterns across the diner floor. The elderly man adjusted his position in the booth, his military patches catching the sunlight. One medal in particular seemed to gleam brightly, though Margaret was too far away to read what it represented. His presence filled the space with a quiet dignity that made her discomfort even more pronounced. As more time passed without service, the atmosphere in the diner began to change. The subtle tension was becoming more noticeable to everyone present. Margaret realized she was creating a situation that would soon be impossible to ignore, but she felt trapped by her own prejudices and the fear of confronting them. The simple act of walking over to take an order had become a monumental challenge that revealed the depth of her ingrained biases. 20 minutes had passed since the elderly man entered the diner, and his patient demeanor was beginning to shift into something more resigned. He folded the menu carefully and placed it back on the table, then removed his reading glasses and tucked them into his shirt pocket. His weathered hands, marked by age spots and old scars, rested on the table as he continued to wait. The older white couple in the corner booth began whispering to each other, their voices growing slightly louder with each exchange. The woman, wearing a floral print dress, leaned toward her husband and gestured discreetly toward the elderly man. Her husband, a portly gentleman with thinning hair, shook his head in disapproval as he watched Margaret continue to avoid her obvious customer. Margaret felt the weight of their stares and knew that her behavior was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone in the restaurant. Her hands trembled slightly as she refilled the same coffee pot for the second time, trying to look busy while avoiding any direct interaction with the man who clearly needed service. The young mother with the toddler had also begun to notice the strange dynamic. She looked between Margaret and the elderly man several times, her expression growing more confused and concerned. Her little boy, sensing his mother's unease, stopped coloring and looked around the restaurant with wide, curious eyes. Janet returned from her break, pushing through the kitchen doors with a fresh apron tied around her waist. She was a woman in her 40s who had worked at the diner for over a decade, known for her efficient service and warm personality with customers. As she surveyed the dining room, her experienced eyes immediately noticed the elderly man sitting, alone without any sign of service. She walked directly to Margaret, who was now aggressively wiping down the already spotless coffee machine. Janet's voice was quiet but firm as she approached her younger colleague. She asked why the gentleman by the window hadn't been served yet, glancing between Margaret and the customer with growing understanding of the situation. Margaret's face flushed red as she struggled to find an explanation that wouldn't reveal her true motivations. She mumbled something about being busy with other tasks and not noticing when he came in, but her excuses sounded hollow even to her own ears. Janet's expression shifted from confusion to disappointment as she began to realize what was really happening. The elderly man had noticed Janet's return and the conversation between the two servers. He had lived through enough decades to recognize the signs of prejudice, having experienced them countless times throughout his life. His military training had taught him patience and dignity in the face of adversity, but that didn't make these moments any less painful. Janet made a decision that would change the trajectory of the afternoon. She walked directly to the elderly man's table, her smile genuine and welcoming as she introduced herself and apologized for the delay in service. Her voice carried clearly across the now quiet diner, and every customer could hear her warm greeting and professional demeanor. The man's face brightened considerably as Janet approached. He smiled broadly and thanked her for coming over, his voice carrying the refined tone of someone who had received a good education despite the barriers of his generation. He mentioned that he had been looking forward to trying the diner's famous apple pie that he had heard about from friends. As Janet took his order, she noticed the details of his military jacket more clearly. The patches indicated service in multiple conflicts, and the medals suggested someone who had served with distinction. She found herself genuinely interested in his stories, and their conversation began to flow naturally as he ordered coffee and a slice of pie. Margaret watched this interaction from behind the counter, feeling a mixture of relief and shame. Part of her was grateful that Janet had stepped in to handle the situation, but another part of her was beginning to recognize the ugliness of her own behavior. She had never been forced to confront her prejudices so directly before. The atmosphere in the diner began to lighten as Janet's professional warmth filled the space. The other customers relaxed visibly and normal conversation resumed at the various tables. However, Margaret remained tense, knowing that her actions had been witnessed by everyone present and that there would likely be consequences for her behavior. The elderly man began sharing stories about his time in the military with Janet, his voice carrying across the restaurant as he spoke about his service during the Korean War. His words painted pictures of courage and sacrifice that commanded respect from anyone listening. The other customers found themselves drawn into his narrative, creating an unexpected moment of connection in the small diner. Margaret realized that she had not only failed in her professional duties, but had also missed an opportunity to learn from someone with remarkable life experiences. The man's dignity and grace in the face of her treatment made her own behavior seem even more shameful. She began to understand that her prejudices had blinded her to the humanity and worth of another person. The situation was far from over, and Margaret sensed that her choices in the next few minutes would have lasting consequences for her job and her future. As Janet served the elderly man his coffee and apple pie, the conversation between them grew more animated and engaging. The man introduced himself as Robert Washington, a 78-year-old retired Army sergeant who had moved to the area recently to be closer to his grandchildren. His stories about military service were captivating the entire diner, creating an atmosphere of respect and admiration. Robert spoke about his experiences during the Korean War with a mixture of pride and humility that touched everyone listening. He described the bitter cold of Korean winters, the bonds formed with fellow soldiers, and the challenges of serving his country during a time when segregation was still legal in many parts of America. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen both the worst and best of humanity. The older white couple who had been watching the situation unfold found themselves completely absorbed in Robert's stories. The woman, who had initially been critical of Margaret's service, was now leaning forward in her booth, hanging on every word. Her husband nodded appreciatively as Robert described acts of heroism and sacrifice that went far beyond the call of duty. Margaret continued to watch from behind the counter, feeling increasingly isolated and ashamed. She could see that Robert was not only a distinguished veteran, but also a fascinating and educated man with incredible life experiences. Her prejudices had prevented her from recognizing his worth and had caused her to miss what was clearly an enriching encounter. The young mother with her toddler had also become engaged in the conversation. She explained to her little boy that the gentleman was a war hero who had helped protect their country. The child looked at Robert with wide-eyed wonder, asking innocent questions about soldiers and heroes that made the elderly man chuckle warmly. Janet's genuine interest in Robert's stories was creating a beautiful moment of human connection that stood in stark contrast to Margaret's earlier behavior. She asked thoughtful questions about his service and listened intently to his responses, treating him with the respect and dignity that every customer deserved, regardless of their background. Robert pulled out a worn wallet from his jacket pocket and showed Janet a faded photograph of his unit from Korea. The black and white image showed young men in military uniforms, their faces serious but hopeful. He pointed to his younger self in the photo, a handsome soldier with the same kind eyes that now looked out from his aged face. As the conversation continued, Robert mentioned that he had been awarded the Bronze Star for valor during a particularly dangerous mission in Korea. He spoke about it humbly, emphasizing the teamwork and sacrifice of his fellow soldiers rather than his own heroism. The medal visible on his jacket suddenly took on new meaning for everyone in the diner. Margaret felt a deep sense of regret washing over her as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. She had refused to serve a genuine American hero, someone who had risked his life for his country and embodied the values of courage and service. Her behavior seemed not only wrong but also profoundly unpatriotic. The bell above the entrance chimed again, and Margaret looked up to see Mr. Rodriguez, the diner manager, returning from his errand to the bank. He was a fair-minded man in his 50s who took pride in running an establishment that welcomed all customers equally. His family had immigrated from Mexico when he was a child, and he understood the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. Mr. Rodriguez immediately sensed that something significant had occurred during his absence. The energy in the diner was different, with an unusual focus on one table where Janet was serving an elderly black gentleman. He noticed Margaret's uncomfortable posture and guilty expression, and his experienced manager's instincts told him that there had been some kind of incident. Robert noticed the manager's return and nodded politely in his direction. Mr. Rodriguez approached the table to introduce himself and welcome Robert to the diner, his genuine hospitality evident in his warm smile and respectful tone. Robert responded graciously, mentioning how much he was enjoying both the pie and Janet's excellent service. As Mr. Rodriguez chatted briefly with Robert, he began to piece together what had likely transpired. Janet's pointed comments about providing proper service to all customers, combined with Margaret's obvious discomfort, painted a clear picture of the situation. His expression grew more serious as he realized the implications of what had occurred. The older white couple decided to approach Robert's table directly, introducing themselves and expressing their gratitude for his military service. They apologized for the earlier delay in service, making it clear that they had witnessed Margaret's behavior and found it unacceptable. Their public show of respect for Robert made Margaret's actions seem even more isolated and wrong. Margaret knew that her behavior would soon be reported to Mr. Rodriguez, and she began to panic about the consequences. She had never been in serious trouble at work before, and the thought of losing her job terrified her. More importantly, she was beginning to recognize that her actions reflected poorly on her character and values as a person. The situation was rapidly moving beyond her control, and Margaret realized that she would soon be held accountable for choices that had revealed the worst aspects of her character. Mr. Rodriguez finished his conversation with Robert and walked purposefully toward the counter where Margaret was nervously wiping the same spot for the 10th time. His expression was serious but controlled, the look of a manager who had dealt with difficult situations before, but hoped he wouldn't have to deal with this particular kind of problem in his establishment. Janet approached them both, her face showing a mixture of disappointment and professional concern. She had worked with Margaret for almost a year and had generally found her to be a decent employee, which made the afternoon's events even more surprising and troubling. She explained the situation to Mr. Rodriguez in quiet, measured tones, describing how she had returned from break to find Robert waiting without service. Margaret's heart pounded as she listened to Janet's account of events. She wanted to defend herself or offer explanations, but she knew that any excuse she could provide would only make her look worse. The truth was that she had deliberately avoided serving Robert because of his race, and no amount of justification could make that behavior acceptable. Mr. Rodriguez listened carefully to Janet's report, his expression growing increasingly grave as he understood the full scope of what had occurred. He had built the Riverside Diner's reputation on providing friendly, welcoming service to everyone in the community, regardless of their background. Margaret's actions threatened everything he had worked to create. The manager glanced toward Robert's table, where the elderly veteran was now engaged in animated conversation with several other customers who had been drawn to his stories. The young mother had moved her toddler closer to hear about Robert's experiences, and even the typically reserved older couple was participating enthusiastically in the discussion. Margaret followed Mr. Rodriguez's gaze and felt a fresh wave of shame as she saw how much joy and connection Robert was bringing to the other customers. His presence had transformed the atmosphere of the diner, creating the kind of warm community feeling that made local restaurants special. She had nearly ruined that with her prejudice and unprofessional behavior. Mr. Rodriguez turned back to Margaret, his voice quiet but firm as he asked her to explain what had happened. He gave her an opportunity to provide her side of the story, though his tone suggested that he already understood the situation quite clearly. His fairness and professionalism made Margaret's behavior seem even more inexcusable by comparison. Margaret struggled to find words that would explain her actions, without revealing their true motivation. She mumbled about being busy and distracted, but her excuses sounded weak and dishonest even to her own ears. Mr. Rodriguez's patient silence made it clear that he wasn't buying her explanations and was waiting for her to tell the truth. The weight of the moment pressed down on Margaret as she realized that her career at the diner was likely over. More importantly, she was beginning to confront the ugly reality of her own prejudices and the harm they could cause to others. The shame she felt was deeper than just professional embarrassment. It was a recognition of moral failure. Robert's laughter carried across the restaurant as he shared another story with his growing audience. The sound was warm and infectious, filling the space with genuine joy. Margaret realized that his grace and dignity in the face of her treatment made him a bigger person than she had been, and that recognition was deeply humbling. Mr. Rodriguez made his decision with the careful consideration of someone who understood the gravity of the situation. He explained to Margaret that refusing to serve customers based on their race was not only morally wrong but also illegal discrimination. The diner could face serious legal consequences if such behavior continued, and he could not allow it to happen again. The older white couple approached the counter, having finished their conversation with Robert. They spoke directly to Mr. Rodriguez, praising Janet's professionalism and expressing their dismay at Margaret's treatment of such a distinguished customer. Their words carried the weight of long-time patrons who expected better from an establishment they had supported for years. Janet stood quietly nearby, feeling conflicted about her colleague's situation, but knowing that she had done the right thing by providing proper service to Robert. She had seen too many instances of discrimination in her lifetime to remain silent when it occurred in her workplace. Her actions had helped salvage the situation and maintain the diner's reputation. Margaret listened to the conversation swirling around her, feeling increasingly isolated and ashamed. She began to understand that her actions had consequences that extended far beyond her own job security. She had potentially damaged the diner's reputation, hurt an innocent customer, and revealed character flaws that she would need to confront honestly. The afternoon sunlight continued to stream through the windows, but the atmosphere had completely changed from when Robert first entered. What had started as a moment of prejudice and discrimination had evolved into a lesson about human dignity, professional responsibility, and the consequences of allowing bias to guide behavior. Mr. Rodriguez prepared to make the decision that would determine Margaret's future at the Riverside Diner, knowing that his choice would send a clear message about the values his establishment would uphold. Mr. Rodriguez asked Margaret to step into his office, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority that made clear this was not a request. The small office behind the kitchen was cramped but tidy, filled with schedules, supply invoices, and photos of the diner's staff at various community events. The walls told the story of a business that prided itself on being part of the local community. Margaret followed him reluctantly, her legs feeling unsteady as the reality of her situation became undeniable. She had never been called into the manager's office for disciplinary action before, and the gravity of the moment was overwhelming. Through the office window, she could still see Robert holding court with the other customers, his animated storytelling creating exactly the kind of atmosphere the diner was known for. Mr. Rodriguez closed the door and gestured for Margaret to take a seat in the chair across from his desk. He remained standing for a moment, looking out at the dining room where Robert was now showing the young mother's toddler his military medals. The child's excited questions and Robert's patient explanations created a heartwarming scene that contrasted sharply with the serious conversation about to take place. The manager sat down heavily in his chair and looked directly at Margaret, his expression reflecting both disappointment and resolve. He had hired her based on positive references and her apparent eagerness to work, but her actions today had revealed a side of her character that was incompatible with the values of his establishment. He began by asking her directly whether she had refused to serve Robert because of his race. Margaret felt trapped by the directness of the question. She could continue lying and hope to salvage her job, or she could finally confront the truth about her behavior and motivations. The weight of the afternoon's events, combined with Mr. Rodriguez's patient but penetrating gaze, made it impossible for her to maintain her pretense any longer. Fighting back tears of shame and frustration, Margaret admitted that she had been uncomfortable serving Robert because of his race. The words felt foreign and ugly coming out of her mouth, but she found herself unable to stop talking. She described the attitudes she had grown up with, the conversations with Derek that reinforced her prejudices, and the fear and discomfort she felt when confronted with situations that challenged her worldview. Mr. Rodriguez listened without interruption, his expression remaining neutral, but his disappointment evident. He had built his business on the principle that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background. His own family's experiences as immigrants had taught him the value of creating welcoming spaces where people could come together as equals. When Margaret finished her confession, Mr. Rodriguez explained that her behavior constituted illegal discrimination and created a hostile environment for customers. He described the potential legal consequences for the diner and emphasized that such actions violated every principle the establishment stood for. His words were measured but firm, making clear that this was not just a minor policy violation. Margaret tried to apologize and promised that she would never behave that way again, but Mr. Rodriguez gently cut her off. He explained that trust was essential in customer service and that customers needed to know they would be treated fairly regardless of who was working that day. Her actions had broken that trust in a way that could not be easily repaired. The manager stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Robert, who was now signing an autograph for the young boy using a napkin from the table. The elderly veteran's kindness and patience with the child demonstrated exactly the kind of character that deserved respect and admiration. The contrast with Margaret's behavior was stark and undeniable. Mr. Rodriguez turned back to Margaret and delivered his decision with quiet finality. He explained that her employment at the Riverside Diner was terminated effective immediately. She would be paid for the hours she had worked that day, but she was not welcome to return as an employee. The decision was based not only on her discriminatory behavior, but also on her dishonesty in trying to cover it up. Margaret felt the full weight of losing her job crash down on her. The income from the diner was essential for her survival and her plans for nursing school. More troubling was the realization that she would struggle to explain this termination to future employers. She had destroyed her employment prospects through her own prejudice and poor judgment. The manager's decision was swift and decisive, reflecting his understanding that discrimination could not be tolerated in any form. He had seen too many businesses fail to take a strong stand against prejudice, and he was determined that the Riverside Diner would never be one of them. His actions sent a clear message about the establishment's values. Margaret gathered her belongings from her locker in stunned silence, the reality of her situation slowly sinking in. The other kitchen staff had heard about the incident and watched her with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Her reputation in the small community would suffer, and word of her termination would likely spread quickly through local networks. As she prepared to leave the diner for the last time, Margaret caught a final glimpse of Robert through the kitchen doors. He was shaking hands with the other customers, having clearly made several new friends during his visit. His dignity and grace remained intact despite her earlier treatment, demonstrating a strength of character that she was only beginning to understand. The termination was complete, but the consequences of Margaret's choices would extend far beyond the loss of her job. Margaret walked out of the Riverside Diner in the late afternoon heat, carrying a small box with her personal belongings and feeling the weight of her actions settling heavily on her shoulders. The parking lot seemed different somehow, as if Her termination had changed her relationship with the entire neighborhood. She sat in her car for several minutes, unable to start the engine as she processed what had just occurred. Through the diner's windows, she could see that Robert was still inside, now sharing coffee and conversation with Janet and several regular customers who had stayed past their usual departure time. His presence had created an impromptu community gathering that brought out the best in everyone around him. Margaret realized that she had not only lost her job, but had also missed an opportunity to be part of something meaningful and positive. The drive home to her apartment was filled with anxiety about how she would explain the situation to Derek. Their relationship was built partly on shared prejudices and complaints about social changes they didn't understand or accept. She began to worry that Derek's reaction would reinforce the very attitudes that had gotten her into trouble, making it harder for her to learn from her mistakes. When she arrived at their small apartment, Derek was sprawled on the couch watching television and drinking beer. His casual greeting turned to concern when he saw her carrying the box of belongings in the middle of her shift. Margaret found herself struggling to explain what had happened without revealing the full extent of her discriminatory behavior. Derek's initial reaction was anger directed at Mr. Rodriguez and the diner's management. He immediately assumed that Margaret had been treated unfairly and began ranting about political correctness and reverse discrimination. His response made Margaret uncomfortable in a way she had never experienced before, as she began to recognize how toxic their shared worldview had become. For the first time, Margaret found herself disagreeing with Derek's automatic assumptions and defensive reactions. She tried to explain that her termination was justified and that her behavior had been genuinely wrong, but Derek dismissed her concerns and continued to blame everyone except her. The conversation revealed deep differences in their values that had been hidden beneath surface-level agreement. As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself thinking repeatedly about Robert's dignity and grace in the face of her treatment. She began researching Korean War veterans online, learning about the challenges they faced both during their service and after returning home to a segregated society. The more she learned, the more ashamed she became of her ignorant assumptions and prejudicial behavior. The financial implications of losing her job began to sink in as Margaret reviewed her budget and savings. Without the diner income, she would struggle to pay rent and would definitely have to postpone her nursing school plans. The practical consequences of her discrimination were severe and would affect her life for months or potentially years to come. Margaret's parents called that evening, and she found herself unable to tell them the truth about her termination. Their casual racism had shaped her attitudes, but she was beginning to understand that blaming them wouldn't excuse her own choices as an adult. She needed to take responsibility for her behavior and work to change the prejudices that had caused so much harm. Over the following days, word of Margaret's termination spread through the community's informal networks. The story of Robert's treatment at the diner became a talking point in local barbershops, churches, and community centers. Most people expressed outrage at Margaret's behavior and praised Mr. Rodriguez for taking swift action to address the discrimination. Margaret struggled to find new employment as potential employers learned about the circumstances of her termination. Several restaurant managers in the area had heard about the incident and were reluctant to hire someone with a history of discriminatory behavior. Her reputation in the service industry was severely damaged, limiting her options for similar work. The incident also forced Margaret to confront the broader implications of her worldview and relationships. She began to question the attitudes that Derek and her family had normalized, recognizing that their casual prejudices could lead to serious, real-world consequences. The process of examining her own beliefs was uncomfortable, but necessary for personal growth. Meanwhile, Robert became a regular customer at the Riverside Diner, forming genuine friendships with Janet and several other patrons. His weekly visits became something of a community event, with people stopping by specifically to hear his stories and benefit from his wisdom and perspective. The diner's reputation for welcoming all customers was strengthened by the incident and its aftermath. Mr. Rodriguez's decisive action in terminating Margaret sent a clear message throughout the community about the values his establishment would uphold. The diner experienced an increase in business from customers who appreciated his commitment to treating everyone with dignity and respect. His principles had proven to be not only morally right, but also good for business. Margaret eventually found work at a retail store across town, but the pay was lower and the work less satisfying than her position at the diner. The experience served as a constant reminder of how her prejudices had damaged her own prospects while failing to harm the person she had tried to mistreat. Robert's grace and dignity had ultimately triumphed over her discrimination, providing a powerful lesson about the consequences of hatred and the strength of human character. The incident became a defining moment for everyone involved, demonstrating how individual choices about treating others with respect can have far-reaching consequences for entire communities.